Tarot as a tool for the post-religious search for meaning, examining the deck as a personalized, non-dogmatic structure for ritual and psychological self-analysis in a secular world. Introduction. In an era characterized by declining institutional religious affiliation and the proliferation of individualized spiritual practices, the tarot has emerged as an unexpected companion to those navigating what Charles Taylor termed the secular age. Once dismissed as mere fortune-telling paraphernalia or occult mysticism, the tarot deck has been reclaimed by contemporary seekers as a sophisticated tool for psychological introspection, ritual practice, and meaning making that operates outside traditional religious frameworks. This essay examines how tarot functions as a particularly well-suited instrument for post-religious individuals seeking structure, symbolism, and self-understanding in a world where grand narratives have fractured and personal authority over meaning has become paramount. The resurgence of tarot in secular contexts is not simply a trend, but rather a symptom of deeper cultural shifts regarding how individuals construct meaning in the absence of inherited religious certainties. Unlike dogmatic systems that demand adherence to specific theological claims, tarot offers what might be termed a choose your own ontology approach to symbolic engagement. Users may interpret the cards through psychological, archetypal, narrative, or even purely aesthetic frameworks without being required to affirm supernatural beliefs. This flexibility, combined with the deck's rich symbolic vocabulary and structured yet open architecture, positions tarot as an ideal technology for the kind of reflexive, personalized spirituality that characterizes contemporary post-religious life. The post-religious landscape and the search for meaning. To understand tarot's contemporary appeal, we must first map the terrain of post-religious experience. The decline of traditional religious participation in Western societies has been extensively documented, but particularly among younger generations who increasingly identify as spiritual but not religious or entirely secular. This shift does not necessarily indicate a wholesale abandonment of transcendent concerns or the human impulse toward ritual and symbolic meaning-making. Rather, it represents a transformation in how such needs are met and a rejection of the institutional, hierarchical, and often exclusionary structures of organized religion. The post-religious condition creates particular psychological and existential challenges. Without inherited frameworks for understanding suffering, purpose, moral action, and life transitions, individuals must construct their own systems of meaning from available cultural materials. This freedom is simultaneously liberating and burdensome, what sociologist Peter Berger identified as the vertigo of relativity. People still experience the fundamental human need for ritual marking of time, symbolic resources for processing experience, and coherent narratives that connect individual moments to larger patterns of meaning. The question becomes, where do such resources come from when traditional religion no longer provides them? Enter tarot, a system that offers precisely what post-religious seekers require: a pre-existing symbolic vocabulary that nonetheless demands personal interpretation, a ritual structure that is infinitely adaptable, and a narrative framework flexible enough to accommodate diverse worldviews. Unlike religious texts that claim divine authority, tarot explicitly positions the interpreter as the ultimate authority over meaning. The cards do not dictate truth, but rather serve as mirrors, prompts, and provocations for self-reflection. The architecture of tarot, structure without dogma. The tarot deck's design embodies a remarkable balance between structure and openness that makes it particularly suitable for post-religious use. The traditional 78-card deck divides into the major arcana and minor arcana, creating what amounts to a comprehensive symbolic lexicon for human experience. The major arcana traces an archetypal journey from the naive beginning of the Fool through various encounters with authority, crisis, transformation, and ultimately integration, often interpreted as representing significant life themes or psychological states. The minor arcana, divided into 4 suits, addresses the more mundane aspects of daily existence: relationships, conflicts, work, and emotion. This structure provides what religious systems have always offered: a map of human experience. However, unlike religious cosmologies that prescribe specific interpretations, Tarot's symbolic system remains deliberately polysemous. The Tower card might signify necessary destruction, sudden revelation, divine intervention, or the collapse of false structures, depending on context and interpreter. This multiplicity of meaning is not a bug, but a feature, allowing users to find personal relevance without being constrained by orthodoxy. The deck's visual and narrative richness creates what semiotician Umberto Eco might call an open text, one that invites active participation from its audience. Each card functions as a complex symbol that can be interpreted through various lenses: Jungian archetypal psychology, narrative theory, color symbolism, numerology, elemental associations, or purely intuitive personal resonance. This interpretive flexibility means that tarot can accommodate users across a wide spectrum of beliefs, from strict materialists who view it as a randomizing tool for accessing unconscious knowledge to those who maintain some form of spiritual ontology without embracing religious dogma. Tarot as psychological technology. One of the most compelling frameworks for understanding tarot's post-religious appeal is through the lens of depth psychology, particularly Jungian approaches that emphasize the archetypal content of the unconscious mind. Carl Jung himself recognized the tarot's symbolic richness, though he did not write extensively about it. Contemporary practitioners and psychologists have developed sophisticated psychological readings of tarot that entirely bracket questions of supernatural causation while maintaining the practice's capacity for insight. From this perspective, tarot functions as a projective technique similar to the Rorschach inkblot test or guided visualization. The random or semi-random arrangement of symbolic images creates a structured ambiguity onto which the querent projects their unconscious concerns, conflicts, and knowledge. The act of interpretation itself becomes therapeutic, forcing articulation of inchoate feelings and recognition of patterns that might otherwise remain below conscious awareness. The cards do not reveal the future or external truths, but rather externalize internal psychological material in a form that can be examined and worked with. This psychological framing resolves the epistemological problem that often troubles rational-minded individuals drawn to tarot. One need not believe in anything supernatural to benefit from the practice. The mechanism of insight relies not on the cards possessing information, but on the human mind's pattern recognition capabilities and the productive constraints that a symbolic system provides for self-reflection. As psychologist and tarot researcher Robert M. Place has argued, tarot creates a theater of the mind where psychological dynamics can be staged and observed. The ritual of tarot reading itself serves important psychological functions. The physical acts of shuffling, drawing, and laying out cards create a liminal space, a bounded time and place set apart from ordinary life where different modes of thinking are permitted. This ritualization signals to the unconscious mind that introspection is occurring, potentially accessing intuitive knowledge that purely analytical thinking might bypass. The very physicality of the cards, their weight and texture, grounds the abstract work of self-reflection in embodied experience. Ritual without religion, the liturgical dimension of tarot practice. While tarot's psychological utility explains much of its appeal, this framing alone cannot account for the deeply ritualized way many practitioners engage with their decks. The post-religious condition has not eliminated the human need for ritual. It has simply transferred that need to new contexts and forms. Tarot provides a structure for personal ritual practice that fulfills many of the same functions as religious liturgy without requiring adherence to specific theological claims. Consider the typical tarot reading ritual: the creation of sacred space, the formulation of a question or intention, the shuffling as a form of meditation, the ceremonial laying out of cards in prescribed patterns, the contemplative interpretation, and often some form of journaling or other integration practice. This sequence mirrors the structure of religious ritual: preparation, invocation, revelation, interpretation, and incorporation, but remains entirely under the practitioner's control and open to personal modification. The ritualization of tarot practice serves several functions that parallel religious ritual. First, it marks time as significant, transforming ordinary moments into occasions for meaning-making. In traditional religious contexts, liturgical calendars and daily prayer times create temporal structure. Tarot readings can serve similar purposes for post-religious individuals, marking transitions, celebrating achievements, or processing difficulties. Second, ritual creates psychological boundaries that facilitate altered states of consciousness, not in any mystical sense, but in terms of accessing intuitive, associative, or creative modes of thinking that differ from everyday pragmatic consciousness. Third, and perhaps most importantly for post religious seekers, tarot ritual provides a sense of connection to something larger than the isolated self. This need not be supernatural. It might be connection to archetypal human experiences, to the collective unconscious, to the continuity of human symbolic traditions, or simply to one's own deeper wisdom. The practice can generate what sociologist Emil Durkheim identified as the essential function of religion, the creation of meaningful community and shared symbolism, even if that community is sometimes a community of one with oneself. Personalization and authority in post religious practice. A defining characteristic of post religious spirituality is the shift of religious authority from external institutions to individual experience and judgment. This individualization has been critiqued as narcissistic consumerism, cafeteria spirituality that picks and chooses appealing elements without commitment or depth. However, it can also be understood as a necessary response to religious institutions' historical failures and the pluralistic reality of contemporary life, where no single tradition can claim uncontested authority. Tarot exemplifies this personalized approach to meaning making. Users select decks based on aesthetic resonance, cultural identification, or thematic interests. Traditional Rider-Waite-Smith imagery competes with countless variations featuring different artistic styles, cultural traditions, and thematic focuses. This proliferation of decks reflects and enables personal customization of the symbolic vocabulary one works with, allowing for representation and resonance that traditional religious imagery may not provide. Similarly, interpretive approaches to tarot are highly personalized. While traditional meanings and systems exist, practitioners are encouraged to develop personal relationships with their cards and to trust their intuitive responses. A card's meaning emerges through dialogue between traditional associations and personal experience, creating a living symbolic system that evolves with the user. This stands in stark contrast to religious hermeneutics that privilege authorized interpretations and discourage individual deviation from established doctrine. The personalization of tarot practice extends to the construction of spreads, the development of personal rituals around reading, and the integration of tarot with other practices such as meditation, journaling, therapy, or creative work. This bricolage approach, assembling meaningful practices from diverse sources, characterizes much post religious spirituality and reflects a postmodern approach to meaning making where no single meta narrative holds exclusive claim to truth. Critics might argue that such radical individualization undermines the very communal and traditional dimensions that give symbolic systems their power and depth. There is validity to this concern. Symbols divorced from shared contexts and historical traditions may become impoverished or superficial. However, the tarot community, both online and in person, provides contexts for shared interpretation, learning, and tradition transmission, even as individual practice remains central. This balance between personal authority and communal wisdom may actually represent a more sustainable model for meaning making in pluralistic societies than either pure individualism or rigid traditionalism. Narrative structures and the storied self. Contemporary psychology and philosophy increasingly recognize that human identity is fundamentally narrative. We understand ourselves and our lives through stories that connect disparate experiences into coherent wholes. The tarot, with its journey through archetypal situations and its capacity to generate narrative sequences, provides a powerful tool for this narrative self-construction. Each tarot reading creates a story. The particular cards drawn and their positions in relation to one another suggest plot elements, character development, conflicts, and potential resolutions. The querent becomes both author and protagonist, interpreting the symbolic narrative and deciding how it relates to their lived experience. This narrative dimension distinguishes tarot from other forms of self-reflection or decision-making tools. Rather than generating pros and cons lists or isolated insights, tarot situates the individual within unfolding stories that have emotional resonance and dramatic structure. The major arcana sequence itself has been interpreted as a master narrative of human psychological and spiritual development, the fool's journey from innocence through experience to integration. This archetypal story provides a framework for understanding one's own life journey, locating present circumstances within a larger developmental arc. Where am I in this journey? What challenges or lessons does this stage require? What lies ahead if I continue on this path? These narrative questions help organize experience into meaningful patterns rather than random occurrences. For post religious individuals, this narrative function fills a crucial gap left by the decline of religious narratives that once provided comprehensive life stories. Traditional religions offered clear narratives: creation, fall, redemption, judgment, salvation. These grand narratives gave individual lives meaning by locating them within cosmic dramas. When these stories lose their authority, people must construct their own narratives from available materials. Tarot provides a flexible narrative technology that can accommodate diverse life paths without prescribing a single authoritative story. Shadow work and the confrontation with uncomfortable truths. One aspect of tarot practice that parallels deep religious and psychological work is its capacity to surface uncomfortable truths and unacknowledged aspects of the self, what Jungian psychology terms shadow work. Unlike affirmation based spiritual practices or purely optimistic self help approaches, tarot readings frequently present challenging cards and interpretations that resist easy assimilation into preferred self narratives. The Ten of Swords depicts a figure face down with 10 swords in their back. The Five of Cups shows someone mourning spilled cups while failing to notice the full cups behind them. The Devil card represents bondage to material concerns or unhealthy attachments. These images do not flatter or comfort, but rather provoke recognition of painful realities: betrayal, loss, limitation, addiction, self-deception. The practice of sitting with such cards and exploring their relevance to one's life cultivates a kind of unflinching self-honesty that religious confession, psychotherapy, or meditative self-inquiry also pursue. This confrontational dimension distinguishes serious tarot practice from superficial fortune-telling or wishful thinking. The cards do not necessarily tell us what we want to hear. They present a full spectrum of human experience, including its difficult aspects. This comprehensiveness mirrors religious traditions grappling with suffering, sin, and limitation, but places the authority for interpretation and response squarely with the individual rather than with clergy or scripture. The post-religious context makes such shadow work particularly important. Without the containing structures of religious community, confessional practices, or authoritative moral teaching, individuals can struggle with guilt, shame, and moral confusion. Tarot provides a private, non-judgmental space for acknowledging these difficult experiences and impulses. The cards normalize the full range of human experience by depicting it as part of a comprehensive symbolic system. Nothing is excluded or condemned, merely represented and available for reflection. The question of efficacy: does tarot work? A critical question for evaluating tarot as a post-religious meaning-making tool is whether it actually achieves the outcomes it promises. Does engagement with tarot lead to greater self-understanding, better decision-making, psychological integration, or meaningful ritual practice? The answer depends significantly on how we define efficacy and what mechanisms we believe produce beneficial outcomes. If we evaluate tarot using the standards of predictive accuracy, does it foretell actual future events? The evidence is overwhelmingly negative. Numerous studies have failed to demonstrate that tarot readings provide information beyond what could be generated through chance or cold reading techniques. However, this empirical failure only matters if one believes tarot's value lies in its predictive capacity, which most contemporary practitioners explicitly deny. If instead we evaluate tarot as a psychological and meaning-making tool, the relevant standards shift. Does it facilitate self-reflection and psychological insight? Does it help people articulate their concerns and consider alternative perspectives? Does it provide comfort, structure, and ritual in times of uncertainty? By these measures, substantial anecdotal evidence and some preliminary research suggest positive outcomes. Users report that tarot helps them access intuitive knowledge, consider options they might otherwise overlook, process emotions, and make more intentional decisions. The mechanism of efficacy likely involves several factors: the structured randomness that disrupts habitual thinking patterns, the rich symbolism that activates associative and metaphorical thinking, the ritual context that signals importance and invites deeper reflection, and the narrative framing that helps organize experience. Additionally, the very act of formulating questions for tarot readings can clarify what one actually wants to know, a metacognitive process that has value independent of the cards drawn. Importantly, tarot's efficacy may be enhanced by the user's interpretive labor and active engagement rather than diminished by it. Unlike religious practices that might emphasize passive reception of divine grace or truth, tarot demands creative participation. The user must make meaning from symbols, construct narratives from card combinations, and apply insights to their lives. This active engagement may produce deeper learning and integration than more passive forms of guidance seeking. Limitations and critiques. Despite its appeal and utility for many post religious seekers, tarot practice faces legitimate critiques that merit consideration. First, the radical individualization and personalization that makes tarot accessible may also limit its depth. Symbolic systems gain their power partly through shared cultural meaning and continuous tradition. When every user creates their own interpretations, the symbols may become impoverished or merely idiosyncratic. The balance between personal authority and traditional wisdom remains precarious. Second, tarot can become a form of spiritual bypassing or avoidance of practical action. If every difficulty is met with a card reading rather than concrete steps toward change, the practice becomes escapist rather than transformative. The contemplative dimension of tarot should ideally complement rather than replace practical engagement with life's challenges. Third, the psychological framing of tarot, while making it acceptable to rational minded users, may domesticate or diminish something essential in the practice. Some practitioners argue that reducing tarot to a purely psychological tool strips it of its numinous quality and its capacity to connect users with genuinely transpersonal dimensions of reality. This critique suggests that purely secular tarot may be inherently limited compared to approaches that retain some form of spiritual or metaphysical understanding. Fourth, the commercialization of tarot as a wellness commodity raises concerns about superficiality and exploitation. The proliferation of tarot decks, guidebooks, courses, and social media content can transform a profound practice into trendy consumerism that emphasizes aesthetic appeal over genuine engagement with the symbolic and psychological depth that gives tarot its power. Finally, for some individuals, the lack of external authority or communal accountability in tarot practice may prove problematic. The freedom to interpret cards however one wishes could enable self deception or reinforce rather than challenge problematic thinking patterns. Religious structures, for all their limitations, provide external perspectives that can interrupt narcissistic self involvement. Purely personal tarot practice may lack such correctives. Conclusion. Tarot in the ecology of post religious meaning making. Tarot's role in contemporary post religious culture reflects broader patterns in how meaning, ritual, and self understanding are constructed in the absence of inherited religious certainties. It exemplifies both the possibilities and challenges of individualized, eclectic spiritual practices that characterize our current moment. As a tool for psychological self analysis, tarot offers a sophisticated symbolic vocabulary, narrative frameworks, and ritual structures that serve real human needs without requiring adherence to specific metaphysical claims or institutional authorities. The deck's architecture, structured yet open, traditional yet adaptable, comprehensive yet interpretable, makes it particularly well suited to the demands of post religious meaning making. It provides what religious systems have always offered: ways to mark time as meaningful, symbols for processing experience, narratives that situate individual lives within larger patterns, and practices that create space for reflection and transformation. Simultaneously, it grants individual users the authority to determine meaning on their own terms, respecting the pluralistic reality and autonomy that characterizes contemporary life. Whether tarot represents a sustainable long-term alternative to traditional religion or merely a transitional phenomenon in a culture still negotiating its relationship to transcendence remains to be seen. What seems clear is that it addresses genuine needs in ways that resonate with many post religious individuals seeking paths toward self understanding and meaningful ritual practice. The cards themselves offer no final answers, which may be precisely their value in an age suspicious of absolute certainties, yet still hungry for wisdom, beauty, and connection to depths beyond the surface of daily life. In the final analysis, Tarot's significance lies not in whatever supernatural capacities it may or may not possess, but in its function as a bridge between the human need for symbolic meaning making and the contemporary insistence on personal authority over truth. It demonstrates that the impulse toward ritual, symbol, narrative, and transcendence need not depend on traditional religious forms or beliefs, while raising important questions about whether such individualized practices can sustain the depth, community, and transformative power that characterized religion at its best. As the post religious landscape continues to evolve, tools like tarot will likely remain important, not as replacements for religion, but as experiments in new forms of meaning making, appropriate to our pluralistic, secular, yet still fundamentally meaning seeking age.